old, and that should come as no surprise to all of us. Globally, the population age 60 has increased from 205 million in 1950 to around a projected 2 billion by the year 2050. If we break down by developing and developed countries, in developing countries, around 9% were age 60 plus in 2013. And the developing world had around 66%, or 2/3 basically, of the world's oldest were living in developing countries. By 2050, the new projection is that around 19% of the population will be age 60 plus, and 79% of the population of the world's oldest will be living in developing countries. So these pose a bigger challenge for this type of countries because, as I will show you, I think later on, they are not ready to handle this huge amount of increasing population, older population. The growth pace in developing countries has been faster. Between 2010 and 2015, it was an increase of 3.7% annually, the growth in the population, of the older population, I mean. And the projections between 2015 and 2050, although it's smaller at 2.9%, it's still higher than the pace that developed countries had it while they went to this transition. And this is only from the United Nations 2012 report. There has been a new one more recently, but the numbers are pretty much the same or very similar, which is a good thing because I don't have to update this presentation. At the same time, from the socio-demographic perspective, cognitive function does not have a really direct measurement. We cannot just go and say, oh, we magically test this person and we know that is cognitively impaired or not. Sure, there are surveys that apply some cognition batteries that I will talk about in the MHAS a little later, but it's not a medical testing to, like diabetes, that you will test the blood levels and determine that the person is a diabetic or not. So in sociology, we use several other variables, as you might be familiar. We have age, educational attainment, gender, childhood conditions, environmental conditions, chronic conditions. All those are either affected by cognition or affect cognitive functioning at some point. And they can be used as a proxy measurement, as I will do with education and cognition in my research. Now the big question, so what? I told you about a little of the data of how developing countries will have older population, but why is that important? Well, we know that, for instance, life expectancy has increased. The older population has higher life expectancy as it happened all over the world. But this represented a particular challenge for developing countries because now older adults are living longer, which means they will have either chronic conditions or cognitive function problems that they have to be dealt with at some point. The number of adults at risk of mild cognitive impairment with no dementia and dementia will also increase, which means, as I said before, that the use of health services will also increase, which the infrastructure of some of these countries are not capable of handling. Now let's bring it a little bit closer to what I will show you in my research, and this is talking about educational attainment and cognitive function. We know that both are linked, that it's proven by several researchers in the literature. This is only a few of them in that, the Matayana and some colleagues that have found a strong connection to cognitive function. Basically, the more education you get, the better your cognitive functioning should be. There has also been links that show that there are gender differences. In some countries, there has been proof that women learn some abilities better than men do. Like, for example, women are better at verbal tasks, that's the word I was looking for, verbal tasks, while men are better at numeric tasks. And that is consistent also with the medical literature. I will show you some examples later on of that literature. And it also has been found to have a protective effect against cognitive decline, meaning it not only increases your level of education, it also slows it down in the decline when you age. And how does it do that? Well, there are two major theories that talk about how education and cognition work together. The first one is the cognitive reserve theory. That means that the more education you have, the more you have it in your cognitive reserve. And that cognitive reserve starts working once you start aging. As your cognition starts depleting, that reserve that you had left in the tank, basically, starts kicking in. Kind of like the emergency gas that your car might have. And then the compensation theory means that the more education equals a little bit of, as the word says, compensation when the cognitive domain starts to decline or starts to be hindered by old age. This theory comes in and says that, oh, you have enough education in there, so the ones that are being in decline will be compensated by the ones that you have improved by the education. So some domains help the other domains that are declining in cognitive functioning. And now there is a newer theory that is the quality of education by Crow, colleagues, and also several other authors that have talked about it. That it says here that it's not only important the number of years of education that you have studied, sure, it helps, but at the same time, the quality of education that you're receiving it's also important. It doesn't matter that you have 20 years of education compared to somebody else that has 10. If the quality involved in those 20 years is worse than the one that had 10, then the cognitive functioning might be better for that other person, despite the fact that I studied more years, or that the other person did. But the last one is very hard to test, because a lot of the longitudinal studies, that are, like the MHAS and the HRS and other ones, do not include measurements on quality of education, as that is quite really complicated to establish. So now let's talk a little about the Mexican case, which is the one that I'm most familiar with, being Mexican myself. We know that the research on cognitive impairment is scarce, and that is putting it very kindly. The majority of research that is done from the government are just general statistics, so there is not really an in-depth analysis of that data. And sometimes it's not that readily available. It is calculated that around 500,000 to 700,000 cases of dementia were present in the older adult population in Mexico. About 25% of those remain completely undiagnosed, and 10% of this number are actually treated. The rest, nothing happens. And that is part of what I told you about at the beginning, that the developing countries are not ready to handle this because they don't have either the medical personnel nor the infrastructure to help the population. The very few research that has been done regarding dementia and some of cognitive functioning has been done by these authors, but it's only in very located areas. For example, Gutierrez and colleagues found that there is a prevalence of 4.7% of cognitive impairment just in Mexico City, which, as you know, is the capital, or includes the capital. In the metropolitan area, it's around 20 million inhabitants. So 4.7, it's a representative number, but it only applies to this population, which is highly urban. At the same time, Cruz Alcalá found that there are around 3.3 cases of cognitive impairment per 1,000 inhabitants in a smaller city in the state of Jalisco, which is in the central part of the country. So in reality, as I told you, that the research is scarce, where you can see that, you know, yes, these numbers are important and they provide some information, but it's just 2 cities in the country. It's not a nationally representative information. Yeah.
And these are the total populations or some age range?
This is for the total population living in these 2 areas. Now, why is it relevant that we focus on cognitive function in Mexico? Well, first of all, there is very low educational attainment in the country. Around 7.2% of the population in 2010 had no education at all. And yes, the number has declined considerably from the previous decades, but still having 7.2% on a population that it's over 120 million people, then that's also significant. For older adults, which is the focus of this research, the average years of education is 4. So that's not even completing elementary school, which is, as you know, 6 years. There is an inadequate healthcare system, as I'm sure Rebecca Wong might have mentioned some about this in her presentation last time. So there is really no medical personnel, hospitals, clinics, nurses, anything that can handle either cognitive functioning impairment or any other really chronic disease with adequate care. We also know that the top causes of death, according to the literature, are linked to cognitive impairment, such as cardiovascular diseases, diabetes, stroke, and hypertension, which sadly are also starting to become even more prevalent in the Mexican population, particularly diabetes, which at some point is higher than the levels in the United States, which it's even sad. More sad. And around 35% of the elderly population in Mexico lives in poverty. A lot of them is due because they live in rural areas, but still having, it's a significant number that also adds up to the fact that some of these elderly folks not only have to deal with the chronic conditions, but they also have to deal with infectious diseases that are still present in the population. So as you can see, the situation in Mexico, and this also, if you switch Mexico for any other Latin American country, it's pretty much the same scenario. Maybe you can change a thing or two, but not much. And so you can see how this makes the study of cognitive functioning very relevant in the country and in the region as well. So that leads me to our research questions in this case. We tried to grab the MHAS, the Mexican Health and Aging Study, and given the increase in educational attainment that we know happened in the population, we wanted to see that if we could find any differences in the cognitive decline, it's not cohort, it's cross-sections of Mexican older adults. Will there be any higher cognitive scores from one cross-section to the other? And will we find any benefit for women compared to men, which is also important given that women always start at a lower level of education than men do. So they have fewer years than men. Our main hypotheses. We know that cognitive scores have increased overall. That's a fact. But we wanted to see that if the gender gap in cognitive scores will be narrower as women got more education between one cross-section and the other cross-section. So we wanted to see if the more recent cross-section had better cognitive scores and if they were closer or not to those of the men. Our main goals were just to document the gender differences in educational attainment among the older adults, as I said, using the 2001 and the 2012 waves of the Mexican Health and Aging Study. And for this case, I will show you the total cognitive scores only, but we also have this analysis by the cognitive domains, which I'll explain a little bit in a couple more slides. The data, as I've said, it's the Mexican Health and Aging Study, and also Rebecca mentioned before, it's a longitudinal, nationally representative study of older Mexican adults, which is the sister study of the Health and Retirement Study here in the United States, SHARE in Europe, and ELSA in England, and many other studies around the world. But the Mexican Health and Aging Study was actually the second. And in Latin America, it's the only one aside from the Brazilian study that just launched last year, but the Mexican is the oldest and is the only one that remains active because Costa Rica had another one, but they already closed down after only 2 waves. Go. I already said that. So we have, for this case, the participants that were interviewed in 2001, which is the wave 1, with a 92% response rate. Then they had follow-ups in 2003 and in 2012, which is the other one that I will use for this data. Most recently, the 4th wave in 2015 was already done, and the results are already available. But for this research, I will only use the 1st and the 3rd wave. And you can see that it has fairly decent response rates, even better than the HRS. Our sample, there we go. For the 2001 cross-section, we have about 5,000 respondents, and I'll tell you about the characteristics in a little bit. For the 2012 cross-section, we have 7,600 respondents, and the reason that we have this is because in 2012, the sample was refreshed with new people. They were introduced in the sample as the older samples were aging already. So in 2012, it was decided to reintroduce more older adults to have the national representativity remain. In both cases, we use respondents that were age 60 or older that had a direct interview, as those answering through somebody else will not be able to answer the cognition battery adequately. And also, we limited only for those who have the complete cognitive battery results. Why? Because we think it's important to, first, because we analyze all the individual dimensions in the cognitive functioning, but at the same time, if the person doesn't have one of the dimensions, then the picture will not be complete, in our opinion. So that's why we only decided, and that's why we have these numbers, because we decided to have the complete cognitive battery. Speaking of the battery, oh, never mind, that doesn't go first. So we did an OLS regression first, but we converted the total scores into Z-scores. So we standardized them basically. Why, I will tell you in the next slide to make it easier to explain for me, but basically it allows not as easy as interpretation as just having the regular scores, but it's better statistically according to several literature that we saw that have converted the Z-scores for cognitive analysis. As I said, we have the individual cognitive domains and the total cognition score as well. So now is the cognitive measure. This is the one I will spend a little more time explaining it to you. So the Mexican Health and Aging Study, as well as all the longitudinal aging studies, differ in one thing, and that is basically the cognitive measure that they use. While the Health and Retirement Study uses a measurement called the TICS, which is a telephone interview something survey. I don't remember what the C is, but basically they do it by phone. So they cannot ask the same questions that the MHAS does. The Mexican Health and Aging Study, in contrast, they use the cross-cultural cognitive evaluation by Glosser and colleagues. And what it does is that it basically includes several of the domains that I've talked about since the beginning. One of them is the visuospatial ability, which means basically identifying a figure, and they have to circle all the figures that look the same as the one that it's given. Then they have the visuospatial recall, which comes a little later during the cognition test, and it's, oh, you remember the figure that you saw in that little box? Draw it for me. And let's see if they remember it or not. And these are the values. In 2001, it took a value of 0 to 2. In 2006, it was changed from 0 to 6. But there's also literature by Alejandra Michaels, one of my co-authors in this paper, that explains how they did the point conversion. So that's not a problem anymore. They have an equivalency of these. And same for the visuospatial recall. Then we have the verbal learning, which is 8 words in the Mexican Health and Aging Study. And it's basically, I tell you 8 words, you tell them back to me, as many as you can remember in any order. A few minutes later, I will go back to you and say, remember those 8 words? Then tell them back to me again. So that's the verbal recall. And these two is where particularly women in Mexico have done very well compared to men. And finally, we have the visual scanning. And that is, from a given figure, they have to identify all the figures that are exactly the same. So as you can, well, I'll go back a little bit, but as you can tell, this cross-cultural cognitive evaluation not only involves the verbal part, but it's also part of them having to do the exercise, which is why it's also important that the person had a complete battery for our results.
Can I ask you a couple of questions?
Yes. Of the previous one?
Well, I mean, I just can't remember, but they're visual and something. What's the theory regarding why education should affect those things? I'm not saying there isn't one, I'm just curious what it is.
Well, I can tell you from what I've read in the medical literature, which I'm not particularly versed at, but that's what I'm more familiar with right now. Basically, it says that parts of the brain, when you get more education, develop, and some of these are controlled by those areas of the brain. So that's why neuroscience is particularly interested in older adults, because they do brain scans and they see how when they're aging, that part is declining. And if, let's say, the left part of your brain is declining, then that means that, I'm not exactly sure which one of these.
We don't know if it's the content of education or the process of education?
No, the idea now with the quality of education is that it might be both, but I don't think in sociology we can, I don't know if I'm wrong, or you can correct me if I'm saying something that is completely out of line, but I don't think that we can exactly determine like which part of the brain gets affected more, at least in the sociology part.
Okay. And then maybe somebody else knows the answer to this, but so if you wanted to try to make some kind of equivalence between cognition and education, you could look at things like outcomes, like earnings or something like that. I mean, I understand that there's some people who really are cognitively impaired. You see them, you know. But other than that, it's a kind of continuum, right? I mean, you know, you said 3.7%. I mean, there's some boundary, but it's probably just an arbitrary boundary.
Yeah.
Okay. So, how much, you know, are you better off to be 2 standard deviations below the mean in education or in cognitive or above, or how do these things map into each other? Or I don't know, is that a,
I guess, I mean, that depends a lot on who's doing the research, because as you said, some are arbitrary boundaries. And in sociology, for example, we have Eileen Crimmins that does a lot of work in this, and Kenneth Langa, which I cited earlier. He is I will say the cognition expert for the HRS, and they created their own thresholds for being cognitively impaired, mildly cognitively impaired, or functioning properly, but it varies. So for this case, I cannot use theirs because theirs is only applied for the American sample, so they're not equivalent. So it also depends on who's doing the research mostly. Oh, and before I forget, I told you about the C-scores before. This is the reason why we decided to standardize them, because as you can see, this test goes from 0 to 60, which is not exactly the same as this two that go from 0 to 8, or this two that go from 0 to 2 and then 0 to 6. So in order not to have one outweighing the others, the literature by McCardle suggests that you can standardize them into C-scores to make them easier to compare within each other, but makes the interpretation a little harder because, as you said, it's going to be now me talking about 2 standard deviations over the mean, below the mean. Yes?
Earlier you referred to your evidence, broad sort, that females tend to do better on verbal and males better on numerical.
Mm-hmm.
These tests appear to focus very much on verbal but don't have the numerical. Why is that?
Well, because first, these are the ones that started the MHAS from the beginning. Later on in the subsequent waves, the numerical part was added. And when I said that the men have an advantage in numerical, I also meant to say that it's also in construction, like building things, which is, or the spatial ability part. But you're right, there is no numerical at the beginning of the MHAS, but in waves 2, 3, and 4 now, they've added numeracy and other tests to be more consistent with the HRS. The HRS now asks also what's the name of the president and the vice president. Mexico doesn't do that, but they do have counting backwards and adding numbers by 7 to a specific amount. So they added a little bit, like even the HRS has now the verbal fluency word test that they have to list animals, all the animals they can remember, so the MHAS has adapted something like that as well. So it's this, I'm focusing on this because this is the ones that are consistent in 2001 and 2012 for my analysis. The other ones I only had it at 2012, so I didn't want to include them, but you're right, there is some numeracy components in there as well. So what covariates I used in this analysis, obviously for the regression. We have age that I left it continuous in the regression, but for the descriptives that I'll show you in a little bit, I just divided the population 60 to 69 and 70 plus, just to make it more dramatic, I guess, the changes that you'll see. The educational attainment, again, it's continuous in the regression, and we also included a square term because even from 1999, Mendel and colleagues and now other literature has suggested that education has some sort of ceiling effect. You don't get the same benefit from moving from 1 year of education to 2 years of education compared to the benefit that you will receive moving from 19 years of education to 20 years of education. So that's why we have this square term in there. And for the descriptives, we divided into the most common for the Mexican population, which are no education between 1 to 5 years of schooling, which is some elementary but not completed. Then 6 years, which is completed elementary, and 7 plus, which is secondary or as high as they can get. We have gender, of course, male or female. That was only a dummy variable. And we also included the area of residence, whether they were under 100,000 inhabitants or not. And that is the Mexican census cookie cutter definition of what an urban and rural area is. You can adapt it a little bit, but that's what the census says. We also included a health conditions variable that goes from 0 to 5, and that is self-reported by the older adult regarding if a doctor ever told them that they had hypertension, diabetes, stroke, heart conditions, or any respiratory problems. And finally, we also included the number of depressive symptoms, which is a score that goes from 0 to 9 because the MHAS uses an abbreviated version of the CESD battery, which is the Centers for Epidemiology and Study of Depression or something like that. And we found that there is a strong depression and cognition link before, so we decided to include it here as well. Depression is part of mental health, which is very popular nowadays. And there is a link between all the mental health variables, depression, anxiety, and others, along with cognition, and it goes both ways. So that's why we decided that it was important enough to include it. Now let's talk about some of the results. Just in time. So first, a few descriptives on both cross-sections, the educational attainment. First, you will have the red bars will be for 2001, the blue bars will be for 2012, men, women, and the age groups. So that's for 2001. You can see that the men have higher education than women at both age groups. In 2012, the cross-section improved significantly. Well, for their standards, that is significant. And again, men still above women, but at least both genders have shown some signs of improvement. Some more notes on this. The 2012 cross-section had on average 1.4 more years of education than the other one. And it's important in here that we found that there are women with no education. For the 2001 cross-section, we found that there was about 28% of them that had 0 years of education. That number decreased in 2012 to 13%. Still a lot, because I told you that the average was 7.2% for the population. But women, at least they're going in the right direction. For the men, this was not 11, that was 9, I think. But again, it's to show you just they were going down from 22% to around 9% in 2012.
These are all 60-year-olds.
Yes, 60 plus.
And yet, in spite of the improvement for women in not having no education, in the original bar graphs, it looks like in these cohorts, education increased faster for men than for women.
Yeah, they still benefited a lot. The older generations, they're still male-dominated. Now, in terms of the cognitive score, this is the total cognitive score from the sample, and I will show you now men are the red, women are the yellow for 2001 and 2012 and the age groups. And as you can see, the older they get, the lower the cognitive score is, so no surprise there. For the women, it's the same. And if you can see here, for the 2012 cross-section, the levels are very similar compared to these ones. Even though you can say that 2 years or 3 years are, 3 points in the cognitive score are not that different. But for these women, they are really different to have 3 fewer points of cognition. But in the 2012 cross-section, the numbers are barely 1 at the most. So that means that women are improving their cognitive scores. And as we saw, they also improved the years of education.
So increasing like the 10 points, what does that mean? And does that mean I can do now? Okay, I can read something that you showed us some difference in score, but it's hard to see what the score really means unless really I know about the scaling. So, can you say a little bit more about, you see the average is a 40 point, right? The score is a 40. What does that mean? How can I do well functions in those tests?
Well, I can tell you from what I mentioned before in the Langa papers from the HRS, and that's using that scale, so it's not particularly the same as the Mexican example, but just for guidance purposes, I will tell you that Langa has the 27 points is the total cognitive score. And in there, he decides, after his research, that a person that has 6 points or lower, it's considered as having dementia. Then between 7 and 11 points, it's mildly impaired, but no dementia. So it's on the way to having dementia.
If I go back to my comment a minute ago, if education went up more for men on average than for women, why would we pick education as explaining why women were catching up to men?
Because they're benefiting from it. Even though it's not the years of education might increase more for men, but the women are receiving more marginal benefit of every year of education that they've improved. And this is the same for the cognitive score, but by years of education. So now you have 0, 1, 2, 5, 6, or 7 plus for men. And here it should be a thicker bar to separate the 2001 from the 2012. But you can see that if we compare this bar with this bar, and this bar with this bar, and so on, they're all higher. So as more education, the men score has increased, but the women has increased as well, at the point that for those with 7 or more years, for the 2012 cross-section, women are actually having better cognitive score than men. In this case, by almost 4 points in the overall score. So a few more notes on the cognitive scores. There we go. So on average, we found that there was about, the cross-section in 2012 had about 5 points higher cognitive results or cognitive scores than the 2001 cross-section. And this is not as to compare them because they're different, but just to give you an idea of how much it increased. We found that there were narrower gender differences between one cross-section to the other. At some point, as I showed you, the women were already overtaking the men. So we think that educational attainment does seem to bring a benefit for women in the 2012 cross-section. Now, some of the OLS results, and in here we have a lot of covariates, but I will focus on a few of them, and I apologize if you cannot see them well, but I will highlight some of the most important ones. And remember, now these are C-scores that we're taking in here. So this coefficient that you will see is variations above or below, standard deviations below or above the mean. And of course, if it's positive, then that's what we want. So we see that years of education has a impact on both cross-sections. I should have had another square here, but you get the idea. And now it doesn't move. There we go. Females start at a disadvantage already just because they're females, except, as I told you before, for the two verbal domains. This is the total score, and these are the individual domains that I included. So women already have a score advantage on the verbal learning and the verbal recall, but they're at a disadvantage in the other ones, and as well as the total cognitive score.
The coefficient for female, because you have some higher order terms in there, is for people with no education, right? Am I misreading?
Say that again?
Well, I mean, you have a term for female by education.
Yeah, the interaction term.
Right, so then you're looking at the marginal effect when you look at female. So if education, I don't know if it's coded linearly, or maybe it's centered at a mean or something like that. So whatever the female coefficient is, has to be at whatever the level of education is. I mean, it's not a constant female effect.
No, but what I'm talking about is taking into consideration also the interaction. I just squared that term to talk about it. But yeah, you're right, it has the interaction term. So once we have the full effect for female, they still show an advantage in this two, but not in the others.
So I'm just getting at, how is education scored so that, in other words, what's the 0 point for years of education and years of education squared?
Sorry. Here it's continuous, the years of...
So it's 0. So the female, I'm sorry, so I'll repeat what I said. So the female coefficient is the effect among people with no education.
Yeah. So some other results to talk about that are not included in the OLS. We found differences also in the area of residence, which is no surprise given how different the urban areas in Mexico are compared with some of the rural areas. By educational attainment, we found that urban men increased their levels, the years of schooling. Rural men also did, but less so. Females as well, they have lower scores than urban women, but they increased it, not much. In this case, it's only 0.7, what we found in the years of schooling, the average. But still, it's an improvement for them. And these changes were reflected in a difference in score 3.2 and 4.1 for men and women in the 2012 cross-section. They had higher results by this much. Again, not trying to compare both cross-sections, just to give you an idea of what the differences mean. So based on the results of the OLS, we also calculated the predicted Z-scores. And you can see the graph here, and I will focus on 2 points particularly. The red line, the red line are men in 2012. The blue line are men in 2001. And then women in 2012 is the yellow-orangey line with the triangle. And the green one with the square are the women in 2001. The important part here, based on both cross-section results, is the ones in the arrow. So for 2001, we found that the women start getting better scores than the men at around 13, more or less 12 and a half years of education. Once the women reaches this number, then they start improving their cognitive scores higher than the men for the 2001 cross-section only. For those in the 2012 cross-section, the crossover comes earlier, which is in there. So it becomes around 8 years of education, so the women are passing the men in the total cognition scores sooner than they do for the 2001 cross-section.
But that could be also driven by mortality selection, right? So I guess
Yes.
there's a whole bunch of processes driving this, but one is who gets to the various ages and over time. So if education is differentially mortality selective or something like this.
That's one of our limitations. But yes, you're right. It can be driven by other stuff. But at least from what we saw, we find that the women are overtaking the men sooner for the 2012 cross-section. So a quick recap before I run out of time. What did we try to do? We tried to examine the association between education and cognition using Mexico as an example of a developing country. We tried to pay special attention to gender differences, and we used a nationally representative sample of older adults, age 60 plus, both in 2001 and in 2012. What did we find? We found that Mexico gained educational attainment. I show you the descriptives. They had more years on average of education between 2001 and 2012. Total cognitive scores also increased, and there were some relative advantages for women in some of those domains that remained the same. And I should say that even though the results are not here, we found actually that the gap that the women had an advantage over the men in the verbal domains actually became wider for the 2012 cross-section. So they improved even more than the men did in that area, which is there. So women had advantages in verbal domains, and that advantage has been documented both in the sociology literature and in the clinical literature by Kimura and Clark in the sociology, Sunderman and colleagues in the medical literature, as well as other authors as well. Some of the limitations, one of them already mentioned by Dr. Kohler, we have a cognitive tool with only 5 tasks. As I said before, new tasks were added, but we didn't include them because they were not consistent throughout the waves. We had the changes in the administration of tests with the scores that I mentioned. That has been solved by having an equivalence conversion that it's available. If you want to see it, I can send it to you. And also that the verbal recall, so the words, had a slightly longer delay for the 2012. So before in 2001, you will tell me the words, and then we'll wait about a minute or two before I will ask them again. But in 2012, that was shifted in the position of the testing, so it became a little later. So that might have affected some respondents more than others, even though the women still did better, so it might have affected the men only. And some of the variables that we included, especially the chronic conditions, were self-reported. So yes, it's technically that the doctor told them that they had that, but we've seen cases that some person said, oh, I have it, and then the next wave, oh, I'm cured. So it's also taking it with some caution. But that leaves the door wide open, as cliched as that will sound, because there are also other factors that influence the relationship between education and cognitive function. It's just not a two-way road between them. Life experiences, health status, nutrition, social networks, social roles that culturally men and women play in each country are also both affecting the educational attainment that a person will have, and as a consequence, their cognitive function. Some of these are available in the MHAS, some of these are not, so as well, it's still worth putting in. And for those who are fans of cross-national comparisons, there is now a possibility, and this is not a commercial, by the way, the University of Southern California has created this gateway to global aging data that allows all these longitudinal studies that I mentioned to be somewhat comparable, particularly in the cognitive battery, that everybody uses whatever testing they want. So USC has had years of finding the right methodology to make them comparable, and they're now available for the US, Mexico, India, China, Share in Europe, and I believe Tilda in Ireland and ELSA in England. So that's another possibility to at least have other ideas with other developing countries as well as the developed nations. So in the end, educational attainment among women, we found that it's a key element in reducing the gender gap in the cognitive scores. So this is a focus that the public policy should take in terms of benefiting women that were not benefited before in terms of educational attainment. And also I go back to this quality of education theory that sadly I cannot test in the MHAS, but the learning how to learn theory, it's also important in order to determine if education is really having an effect on cognitive functioning, and if so, by how much, because this could also play a role in their testing. And thank you very much. So let the Inquisition begin.
Thank you. It's very interesting work. I see that possibly the open door list are some things that you are going to pursue, which may or may not be true.
Yeah.
Now you're saying yes.
We hope so.
I wondered about some of them because there's a big literature there about the importance of nutrition on educational attainment, but that's focusing very much on people much younger than in MHAS.
Yeah.
And sort of more generally, the way you characterize the open door was, somehow how other variables might intervene between education and cognitive skills, but I didn't see the life cycle, how the life cycle fit into that, since most of the variables that affect education did so 30, 40, 50 years ago. So that was one question. My second question was, it would seem an undoubtedly rich aspect of MHAS is that they are longitudinal data. And to this point, you've only treated them as repeated cross-sections. Yeah. Have you looked at all at the longitudinal relations?
I started to look at, but then the issue that MHAS has at the beginning is that waves 1 and 2 that started in 2001 and 2003, they're fine. There's a 2-year gap. But once you talk about wave 3, there's a 9-year gap between waves 2 and 3. So that poses some statistical challenges in terms of determining longitudinal assessments more effectively. So it's still on the works, but on the back burner for now. We're still thinking now that MHAS will become more regular in terms of wave 4, it's already in 2015. Wave 5 will be 2018. So every 3 years, that will ease a little bit of the longitudinal aspect for the later waves. So, but yeah, it is. I know I treated this as just 2 snapshots, basically, of the data. But the idea will be that to include the whole sample to make it more longitudinal.
But even 2-time point, I was wondering actually, on this issue, you can see that how many, in like 10, 11 years, how the cognitive function changed, right?
Yes.
So 60 in 2001 will be the 72, if my math is correct. Then 73, I'm sorry, the 2012. No, that's whatever. I'm sorry.
Older.
Yes. So you see that how cognitive function changed, right? I mean, mostly I think it will be declining for 11 years period. So I was curious indeed, whether these highly educated people will have a less, the steeper decline as compared to people who have less education. So I think that will also address this issue, because I think from probably 2001, cognitive functions is a function of this nutrition and all other prior things. But once you control for this level in 2001, then start from there and see who actually declined more than others. I think that would be another. Just even 2-time point. I think it would be interesting to look at whether the people have a different speed of decline in functions, cognitive function depends on what their education level was
Yeah.
from their start.
Yeah, definitely. And I started talking with Dr. Kohler about doing something longitudinal that will definitely focus on that. Because I don't think it's been done for Mexico, so it'll be interesting. And Mexico in Latin America is the one that has one of the most complete longitudinal data set for the older population. So this definitely will be a focus for the future analysis. Anything else?
I guess you haven't done that, but does cognition predict mortality? You haven't done any longitudinal analysis. I guess you haven't looked at this.
I haven't, but I know, at least I know from the US example that it does.
Yeah.
So,
It does in
For
Malawi.
education.
It does in
That's
Malawi.
Controlling for education.
Yeah.
And it
So-
does in Malawi.
yeah. Oh, really? Well, I'm guessing it'll be the same in Mexico.
So, I mean, in terms of education, so this is years of formal schooling, right?
Yes, yes.
So what if I don't go to school, but I learn myself? I'm just curious about these things relate to issue about what does really mean about educational attainment. Like, if I don't go to school, formal school, but I still do some learning myself, like, it's hard to imagine at this point, but I think if there's a possibility. So is that, again, I think it's related to Harvard's earlier question about is it content or is it something that we do normal? I'm just curious about what you think about what is like a make education really matter.
You're right, because especially in the rural area, the person might have to quit school because they have to work. But at the same time, they're learning a craft or they're learning a new skill that it might be considered some sort of education, maybe not formal. I cannot measure that with the MHAS because we don't ask the respondents if they learned the skill or something. But maybe if there is occupation, so maybe focusing on that could be an idea, like some manual.
Life experiences, which one might be interpreted at least as part of his occupation related to this.
Yeah, what I also meant with life experiences, it's some sort of major events that they might have gone through, and that's also only included for 2012, if I'm not mistaken, so it wasn't in the previous waves. So they asked if they underwent a major natural disaster, or if somebody from the family died, or if they were in the hospital for a prolonged time. So major events, health-related and also life-related. And the childhood conditions were also improved significantly after the 2001 wave. In the 2001 wave, they only asked if the person had a toilet inside of the house. In 2001, later on, they started asking more questions. So that's why the door is open. You can include a little bit if you get clever with some of those variables.
Presumably the natural disasters you could link to other data.
Yes, yeah.
Assuming that location, the location.
Yeah. Yes.
Are people who are vision impaired not included in the sample because they can't answer the questions? And is the number of people who are vision impaired changing over time, do you think?
It is changing, but it's not changing that much. So if they can answer, visually impaired, it has to be very visually impaired for them not to detect that. Yeah, that'll be the only way they will not be included. Otherwise, if they can answer, then they will be included in the.
One last question. Okay, well, thank you so much.
You're welcome.